The mud in Blackwood Creek was not merely dirt. It was a living, breathing malice that sucked at the boots of every man and woman unfortunate enough to walk its streets. It was a slurry of coal dust, horse manure, and the freezing sleet that had been falling for 3 days straight, coating the entire settlement in a sheen of gray misery. Isabel Sterling knelt in this muck, a stiff brush in her raw red hand. She was scrubbing the boardwalk in front of the Bucket of Blood saloon, the rough wood splintering under her frantic strokes. She was 24 years old, but she moved with the hunched, fearful posture of a beaten dog. She wore a dress of coarse gray wool that had once been white, now stained the color of the town itself. But it was the veil that drew the eye. A swaths of dirty linen wrapped around her head and neck, obscuring the left side of her face completely, leaving only her right eye visible, a wide, terrified orb of pale blue that darted nervously at every sound. "Mr. Spot, Ash girl." The voice cracked like a whip. Silas Crouch, the owner of the saloon, stood in the doorway, a cigar clamped between his yellow teeth. He was a man built of soft dough and hard cruelty, wearing a vest that strained against his paunch. Isabel flinched but didn't look up. She scrubbed harder. Scrub the wood. Ignore the voice. Scrub the wood. "I said you missed a spot," Crouch shouted, stepping out onto the boardwalk. He kicked the bucket of dirty water next to her. It tipped over. The freezing sludge splashed across Isabel's knees and soaked the hem of her dress. She gasped, the cold water shocking her to the bone, but she scrambled to right the bucket. "I'm sorry, Mr. Crouch. I'll fetch more." "You'll fetch nothing until I say so," Crouch sneered. He looked out at the street. It was midday, and a group of miners had gathered, bored and waiting for the shift whistle. They watched the scene with dull, hungry eyes. Crouch grinned. He needed entertainment. "Hey, boys," he called out. "You ever seen a ghost clean a floor?" The miners chuckled. "That ain't a ghost, Silas," one yelled. "That's a scarecrow." "She's a fright, that's for sure," Crouch agreed, stepping closer to Isabel. He loomed over her kneeling form. "Why do you wear that rag, girl? You think you're better than us? You think you're some kind of nun?" "Please," Isabel whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, just let me finish." "I think you're hiding something," Crouch hissed. "I think you're hiding the truth. And in this town, we don't like secrets." He reached down. His hand was fleshy and wet. Isabel scrambled back, crab walking on her hands and knees, but she wasn't fast enough. Crouch grabbed the edge of the linen veil. "Let's see what you are made of." He yanked. The fabric tore. The pin holding it in place scratched Isabel's scalp, but the veil came away. Isabel screamed a short, sharp sound of pure horror and threw her hands up to cover her face. But it was too late. The miners gasped. Some recoiled. One man spat on the ground. The left side of Isabel's face was a ruin. It was a landscape of melted wax. Shiny pink and white scar tissue started at her hairline, consumed her ear, and flowed down her neck like a river of frozen lava. It pulled at the corner of her lip, freezing half her mouth in a permanent grimace of agony. It was the legacy of the mill fire that had taken her family and left her with nothing but debts and nightmares. "God Almighty," a miner shouted. "Put it back on." "Damaged goods," Crouch roared, laughing at her terror. "Look at that! A monster! Who wants to dance with a monster? I'll start the bidding at a nickel." Isabel curled into a ball on the muddy boardwalk, sobbing into her hands, wishing the earth would just open up and swallow her whole. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. "A nickel for a dance," Crouch yelled, playing to the crowd. "Come on, boys, she won't bite, though she might melt if you get too close to the fire." Laughter rippled through the crowd. It was a harsh, jagged sound that cut deeper than the cold wind. Then the laughter stopped. It didn't taper off. It was strangled. A silence fell over the street, heavy and suffocating. The miners backed away, pressing themselves against the walls of the buildings. Even the dog stopped barking. Crouch frowned, looking around. "What's the matter with you lot?" Then he heard it. Hoofbeats, heavy, slow, deliberate. A mule emerged from the mist at the edge of town. It wasn't a pack animal. It was a massive gray beast with ears like semaphore flags. But it was the rider who sucked the air from the street. Thaddeus Knox, the grizzly. He was a giant. He wore a coat made of unrefined bear fur that made him look twice as wide as any man there. A rifle scabbard was slung across his back, the leather worn and dark with age. His face was hidden in the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but a beard as thick and brown as brushwood covered his jaw. He rode into the center of the street. He stopped the mule directly in front of the saloon. He sat there, motionless. He didn't look at the miners. He didn't look at Crouch. He looked at Isabel. He looked at the woman curled on the boardwalk, shivering in the mud, her ruined face exposed to the gray sky. Crouch swallowed hard. His bravado evaporated. Mr. Knox," he stammered. We didn't expect you down from the timberline until the thaw." Thaddeus didn't speak. He simply breathed, a cloud of white vapor escaping the dark tangle of his beard. He shifted in the saddle. The leather creaked a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. He reached into his coat. The miners flinched. Half of them reached for their belts. Thaddeus pulled out a heavy canvas sack. It clinked heavily. He tossed it. It hit the mud at Crouch's feet with a wet thud. It didn't bounce. It was too heavy. "Silver," Thaddeus rumbled. His voice was like a rockslide, deep, rough, and vibrating with a terrifying power. It wasn't a voice used to asking. It was a voice used to commanding. Crouch stared at the bag. He bent down and opened it. His eyes bulged. It's a fortune," Crouch whispered. $50 in silver coin." "For the girl," Thaddeus growled, "and the papers." Crouch looked up. Greed warred with fear in his watery eyes. "You want to buy her indenture?" "I want the noise to stop," Thaddeus said flatly. He nudged the mule forward. The beast stepped up to the boardwalk, towering over the cowering Isabel. Thaddeus reached down. Isabel flinched, turning her scarred face away, waiting for the blow, waiting for the disgust. "You didn't hit her." His hand massive, calloused, wrapped in worn leather closed around her upper arm. It was gentle, impossibly gentle. He lifted. Isabel gasped as her feet left the wood. He hoisted her into the air with one arm, as effortlessly as if she were a doll made of rags. He swung her up and across the saddle in front of him. She landed hard against his chest. The impact knocked the wind out of her. She was engulfed in fur. The smell of him was overwhelming: pine resin, wood smoke, and cold mountain air. He reached around her to grab the reins. His arm was a thick bar of muscle pressing against her ribs. He unbuttoned his massive coat. He pulled the edge of it around her, covering her face, shielding her from the stairs, shielding her from the world. "Hold on," he rumbled against the top of her head. He didn't look back at Crouch. He didn't look back at the town. He kicked the mule. They surged forward, splashing mud onto the bystanders, riding away from the laughter and the pain, and into the silent white heart of the mountains where only the bears and the ghosts dared to live. The ascent to the timberline was a journey into a world stripped of color and mercy. The sleet that had soaked Blackwood Creek turned to hard, stinging pellets of ice, then onto a blinding white powder that swirled around the mule's legs like smoke. Isabel huddled against Thaddeus's chest, buried in the immense fur coat that smelled of old wood smoke and something deeper, the musky scent of a predator. She couldn't feel her feet. She couldn't feel her hands. All she could feel was the terrifying silent heat of the man holding her. He didn't speak. He didn't curse the wind that tried to tear them from the saddle. He navigated the treacherous, narrow switchbacks with a grim, practiced competence. Every so often the mule would stumble on the slick granite, and Thaddeus would grunt a low vibration against her back, tightening his grip around her waist, anchoring her to the beast. Hours bled into a gray, timeless haze. Finally, the mule crested a ridge that seemed to jut out over the edge of the world. "Home," Thaddeus rasped. The word was a rusty hinge opening a door that hadn't moved in years. Isabel peered out from the coat. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress of survival. Built directly into the jagged face of a granite cliff, the cabin was a monstrous structure of blackened logs and roughly hewn stone. A massive chimney belched thick gray smoke into the storm, staining the pristine snow. But it was the sound that terrified her. Even over the wind, she could hear the clattering of bone wind chimes hanging from the eaves, bleached skulls and ribs of small animals, clicking together like skeletal fingers. Thaddeus dismounted. He hit the ground with a heavy thud that shook the snow from his boots. He didn't offer a hand. He simply reached up, grabbed her by the waist, and swung her down. Her legs gave way the moment her boots touched the snow. She crumpled into a heap. Thaddeus caught her by the scruff of her coat, hauling her upright. He didn't carry her like a princess. He marched her toward the heavy oak door, his hand firm on her arm, dragging her along. He kicked the door open. Heat hit her like a physical blow. It was dry, intense, and smelled of burning pine. They stepped inside. Isabel gasped. It wasn't just a cabin, it was a den. The center of the room was dominated by a massive stone hearth that roared with an orange, crackling fire. Traps of all sizes, steel jaws meant for wolves, smaller snares for rabbits hung from the rafters, gleaming dully in the firelight. Furs were everywhere, piled on the bed in the corner, draped over the single chair, nailing to the walls to cure. The air was thick with the scent of raw leather and animal musk. Thaddeus released her. He walked straight to the hearth. He grabbed a poker and stabbed at the logs, sending sparks flying up the chimney. He turned to her. He was covered in snow, his beard stiff with ice. He looked like a yeti who had wandered in from the blizzard. He pointed to a small dark corner near the woodpile. "Yours," he growled. Isabel nodded, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they would crack. She walked to the corner, feeling small and utterly out of place in this cathedral of wildness. She saw a pile of old blankets on the floor, a dog bed, perhaps, or just rags. Thaddeus went back to the fire. He began to strip off his wet gear, gloves, hat, coat. He moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness. "Why?" Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the flames. Thaddeus froze. He turned his head slowly. His eyes, amber and fierce in the firelight, bore into her. "Why, what?" he rumbled. "Why did you buy me?" Isabel asked, hugging her arms to her chest. "Crouch said. He said you're a beast. He said you eat raw meat." Thaddeus snorted. It was a harsh, dismissive sound. "Crouch is a fool," he spat, "and a drunk." He turned fully to face her. He looked at her wet, shivering form. He looked at the scar she was trying to hide with her hands. "I bought the silence," he said flatly. "I heard the noise, the laughing. It sounded like crows picking at a carcass. I hate crows." He walked to the larder, a rough shelf stocked with tins and dried meat. He grabbed a strip of jerky and tossed it to her. It hit her chest. She fumbled to catch it. "Eat," he commanded. "Sleep. In the spring, when the pass clears, I take you to the sisters in Silverton. They take strays." He turned his back on her, effectively dismissing her existence. Isabel stared at his broad back. A stray, she thought. Just another wounded animal he found in a trap. For 3 days, she lived in the corner. Thaddeus ignored her. He was a machine. He woke before dawn, checked his traps, skinned his catch, and stretched the hides. He ate standing up strips of dried meat and hard biscuits. He drank water from a tin cup. He didn't offer her food. He pointed to the larder and expected her to figure it out. Isabel was terrified. She was also starving. But she was also Isabel Sterling. She had run a mill kitchen before the fire. She knew how to make something from nothing. On the 4th morning, Thaddeus left. He took his rifle and snowshoes and disappeared into the white void without a word. Isabel stood up. Her legs were shaky, but her resolve was iron. She looked at the cabin. It was a mess. Furs were piled haphazardly. The floor was covered in pine needles and dried mud. The table was greasy. She found a broom made of stiff twigs. She began to sweep. She swept until her arms burned. She swept the dirt into the fire. She found a bucket and scrubbed the table with snowmelt and sand until the wood showed through the grease. Then she turned to the larder. She found a sack of flour. She found a tin of dried herb sage, thyme, rosemary that looked old but still smelled potent. She found onions in a root cellar. She found a haunch of venison hanging in the cold storage room. She cut the meat. She diced the onions. She made a dough for dumplings. She stoked the fire. She hung the heavy cast-iron pot over the flames. By late afternoon, the cabin smelled different. It didn't smell like musk and wet fur anymore. It smelled of sage. It smelled of roasting meat and savory broth. It smelled of a home. The door opened. Thaddeus stomped in, covered in snow, a brace of rabbits hanging from his belt. He dropped the rabbits by the door with a heavy thud. He stopped. He sniffed the air. His nose wrinkled. He looked confused, like a bear waking up in the wrong den. He looked at the floor. Clean. He looked at the table. Scrubbed. He looked at the fire. A pot bubbled merrily. He looked at Isabel. She stood by the hearth, wiping her hands on a rag. Her scar was flushed from the heat of the fire. She was terrified he would be angry. She was terrified he would throw the food out. Thaddeus walked to the table. He stared at the pot. He reached out with a massive hand. He grabbed the ladle. He dipped it into the stew. He took a sip. Isabel held her breath. Thaddeus paused. He blinked. He tasted salt. He tasted sage. He tasted... He looked at her. His amber eyes were wide. He looked at the stew. Then he looked at the hardtack biscuits still sitting on the shelf, gray, rock-hard, unappealing. He pulled out the single chair. He sat down heavily. He didn't speak. He poured a bowl of stew. He broke a dumpling open. Steam rose from the white interior. He took a bite. He closed his eyes. A look of pure, unadulterated pleasure crossed his face. He let out a long sigh that seemed to deflate his massive shoulders. He opened his eyes and looked at her. He pointed to the other side of the table. He pointed to an empty crate he used for storage. He kicked the crate toward the table. "Sit," he grumbled, his mouth full of dumpling. Isabel sat. Thaddeus pushed the ladle toward her. He poured stew into her bowl. He didn't say thank you. He didn't smile. But he ate 3 bowls of stew, and when he was finished, he didn't go back to his furs. He sat by the fire, watching her clean the plates, a strange, thoughtful expression on his scarred face, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't known existed. Gemini said. The blizzard that descended on the high Rockies was not merely a storm, it was a living, breathing malice of the mountain. It began as a low moan in the valley, a vibration in the floorboards that made the tin cups on the shelf rattle, before exploding into a white-out fury that erased the world. For 3 days, the cabin shuddered under the assault. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the shingles, piling snow against the north wall until the window was nothing but a gray, opaque square of ice. Inside, the air grew heavy and close, the smell of wood smoke turning acrid as the chimney struggled to draw against the downdraft. Isabel paced. She walked the length of the cabin, 12 steps from the hearth to the door, 12 steps back. She was no longer the terrified girl who huddled in the corner. Hunger and necessity had burned that fear away, replacing it with a gnawing anxiety that settled deep in her gut. Thaddeus was late. He had gone out 2 days ago to check the high-line traps before the storm broke. Back by sundown, he had rumbled, his voice as steady as the granite peaks. But sundown had come and gone, swallowed by the white void. Then the next day passed. Now, the third night was falling, and the storm was howling with renewed vengeance. Isabel threw another log on the fire, the sparks flying up the chimney. She gripped the iron poker until her knuckles turned white. He is the grizzly, she told herself. He is part of this mountain. The snow cannot kill him. But she knew the mountain didn't care about legends. The mountain took what it wanted. Suddenly, a sound cut through the wind. Thump! It was a heavy, dull impact against the door. Not a knock, a collision. Isabel dropped the poker. She ran to the door. The heavy oak bar was frozen in place, rime ice sealing the cracks. She threw her shoulder against the wood, fighting the pressure of the wind outside. "Thaddeus!" she screamed, her voice lost in the roar. She heaved the bar up. The latch clicked. The door didn't open, it was blown inward. A wall of snow and freezing air blasted into the room, extinguishing the candle on the table and sending the fire into a frenzy. And with the snow came Thaddeus. He didn't walk in. He fell in. The giant collapsed across the threshold, face down, a mound of snow-covered fur and leather that looked more like a fallen bear than a man. He dragged himself forward 1 inch, his fingers clawing at the floorboards, before his strength gave out completely. "Thaddeus!" Isabel shrieked. She threw her weight against the door, fighting the gale to slam it shut. She dropped the bar, sealing the warmth back inside. She dropped to her knees beside him. He was radiating cold, his coat stiff with ice, but when she touched his face he was burning. "Thaddeus, wake up," she commanded, shaking his shoulder. It was like shaking a boulder. He groaned a low, guttural sound of agony. He tried to push himself up, but his left leg gave way. He collapsed again, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Isabel grabbed his arm. She pulled. She couldn't move him. He was dead weight. "You have to help me," she yelled at him, grabbing a fistful of his coat. "Get up! You have to get to the fire." Thaddeus blinked, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He looked at her, but he didn't seem to see her. He saw ghosts. "The line," he mumbled, his teeth chattering violently. "Broke the line." With a surge of desperate strength, Isabel wedged her shoulder under his armpit. "Push!" she screamed. Thaddeus groaned and drove his good leg into the floor. Together, they dragged his massive bulk toward the hearth. He collapsed onto the bearskin rug, shivering so violently that his boots drummed against the wood. Isabel scrambled to the lamp, relighting it with a trembling hand. She brought it close. She gasped. His left leg, encased in thick buckskin trousers, was soaked in dark frozen blood. The leather was shredded from thigh to knee. "Knife," she whispered to herself. "I need the knife." She ran to the table. She grabbed his skinning knife, the blade with the bone handle. She returned to him. "I have to cut it," she said, her voice shaking. Thaddeus didn't answer. He was muttering names she didn't know, lost in the fever. Isabel grit her teeth. She sliced through the tough leather, peeling the frozen fabric away from his skin. The smell hit her instantly, copper and rot. It wasn't a clean cut. It was a ruin. 4 deep parallel gouges ran down the side of his thigh. The flesh was angry red, swollen tight, and oozing yellow pus mixed with dark blood. "Cougar," Thaddeus rasped, his eyes squeezing shut. "Cat was waiting." Isabel felt bile rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "You lived through fire," she thought fiercely. "You can look at blood." "Water," she said aloud. "Whiskey. Needle." For the next hour, Isabel Sterling ceased to be the Ash Girl. She became a surgeon of the wilds. She boiled water in the cast-iron kettle. She tore her own petticoat into strips. She forced the neck of the whiskey bottle between Thaddeus's teeth. "Drink," she ordered. He drank, coughing as the liquid burned his throat. She poured the rest of the bottle into the wound. Thaddeus roared. His back arched off the floor, his muscles straining against his shirt. He thrashed, his hand flailing out, striking the table leg and splintering the wood. "Hold still!" Isabel yelled, pressing her weight onto his thigh to keep him from tearing the wound further. "I have to clean it." She scrubbed the claw marks. She cut away the dead skin. She threaded the needle. As she worked, sweating in the heat of the fire, she saw him. His shirt had ridden up in his thrashing. His chest was bare to the firelight. It was a map of violence. There were old bullet holes, puckered white craters on his ribs. There were long, thin scars from knives. There was a patch of burn scar on his shoulder that mirrored her own. He wasn't just a trapper. He was a survivor of 100 wars written in flesh. "Mother," Thaddeus whimpered, the giant reduced to a child by the fever. "Cold, so cold." Isabel paused. She placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. It was beating like a trapped bird, erratic and fast. "You're not cold," she whispered, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. "You're safe. You're home." For 3 days and 3 nights the fever held him. Isabel didn't sleep. She couldn't. If the fire died, he froze. If the fever spiked, he convulsed. She became his anchor. She spooned broth into his mouth. She changed the dressings on his leg, flinching at the smell but never stopping. She wiped his body with cool snowmelt when he burned, and piled furs on him when he shook. She learned the landscape of his face, the way his brow furrowed in pain, the silver in his beard, the jagged scar that ran through his eyebrow. On the 4th morning the wind died. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. The sun, weak and pale, filtered through the cracks in the shutters. Thaddeus opened his eyes. The glassiness was gone. The amber was clear, though exhausted. He lay still, listening to the crackle of the fire. He felt the pain in his leg, a dull throb now, not the sharp agony of infection. He felt the warmth of the furs. He turned his head. Isabel was sitting on the low stool by the hearth. She thought he was asleep. She had her back to him slightly. She had a small polished steel mirror propped up on her knees, his shaving mirror. She was changing her own dressing. She had unwound the linen veil. Her face was bare. Thaddeus watched. He saw the ruin. He saw the melted ear, the tight shiny skin that pulled her mouth down, the angry pink ridges that would never fade. Most men would have looked away. Most men would have retched. Thaddeus watched. He watched her dip a rag in water and gently dab the sensitive skin. He watched her wince, her good eye closing in a private moment of pain. He watched the way her hand trembled, not with fear, but with weary resignation. "Does it hurt?" His voice was a wrecked gravel and broken glass. Isabel jumped. The mirror clattered to the floor. She scrambled to grab the veil to cover herself, her hands flying to her face in panic. "No," Thaddeus rasped. He tried to sit up, but his weakness pinned him. He settled for lifting his hand, palm open. "Don't hide." Isabel froze. The linen pressed against her cheek. She looked at him. She saw his eyes. There was no disgust. There was only a deep, aching recognition. She lowered the cloth slowly. It pulls," she whispered, looking at the floor. "When it's cold, it feels like the skin is too tight for the bone." "And the fire?" Thaddeus asked softly. "Does the fire still burn?" Isabel looked at the hearth. "Sometimes, in my dreams." She looked back at him. "Does your leg hurt?" "Only when I move," Thaddeus grunted. "Does your chest hurt?" she asked, her gaze flicking to the scars on his ribs. Thaddeus looked down at his own battered body. "Only when I remember." He looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the fatigue in her eyes, the dark circles, the hollowness. He realized she hadn't slept in days. She had kept death away from his door with nothing but a spoon and a needle. "You stayed," he said, the wonder evident in his voice. "The door was unbarred. You could have taken the silver. You could have run." Isabel stood up. She walked over to him. She didn't cower. She knelt beside the furs. "I told you," she said quietly. "I know what it is to burn. I wasn't going to let the fever take you." Thaddeus reached out. His hand, heavy and scarred, hovered near her face. Isabel held her breath. He didn't touch her. Not yet. He just let his hand rest in the air between them, feeling the heat of her skin. "I thought I was alone up here," he confessed, his voice dropping to a rumble. "I thought I was the only thing too ugly for the world below." He looked into her eyes, one wide and blue, the other pulled tight by the scar. "I was wrong," he whispered. Isabel felt a tear slide down her good cheek. "Is that a compliment, Grizzly?" Thaddeus's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but the beard moved. "It means we are the same breed, Ash Girl. We both walked out of the fire." He let his hand drop to the fur, exhausted by the effort, but the distance between them had vanished. The air in the cabin was no longer charged with fear or suspicion. It was charged with something else, a quiet, terrified understanding that they were no longer fighting the winter alone. "Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below." The spring thaw did not come gently to the timberline. It arrived with the violence of a breaking fever. The silence of the deep winter was shattered by the roar of the creek, swollen with meltwater and mud, tearing through the ravine below the cabin like a brown scar. The icicles that had hung like daggers from the eaves for months lost their grip, crashing onto the porch with startling glass-like explosions. Inside the cabin, the rhythm of life had shifted. The air was no longer just hot. It was humid, thick with the smell of wet earth and the eternal metallic tang of the curing hides. Isabel stood by the woodpile, her face flushed, sweat causing her shirt to cling to her back. She swung the axe, thwack splitting a log of seasoned pine. Her arms, once thin and trembling, had grown wiry and strong over the long winter. She wore a heavy leather apron Thaddeus had cut down for her, cinched tight at the waist. Thaddeus sat on the porch steps. His leg was still bandaged, the linen stark white against his buckskins, but he was mending a trap with his large, capable hands. He was slower, less precise, but the force was still terrifying. Snap! The steel jaws closed on a stick. Snap! He was testing the spring, bending the stubborn metal to his will. He paused, wiping his brow with his forearm. He looked at Isabel. The amber fire in his eyes had softened over the months, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. He didn't speak. He rarely did, but he nodded. It was a language they had built in the silence. "Good wood, good work. We are a team." Suddenly, the mule in the paddock lifted its head, its ears swiveled forward. A low bray started deep in its chest, vibrating through the morning air. Thaddeus went still. The trap hovered in his hands. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't the rhythmic pounding of the axe. It was hoofbeats, many of them, scrambling up the shale path that was treacherous even in dry weather. Isabel let the axe head rest on the chopping block. "Thaddeus?" she whispered. Thaddeus moved to stand, wincing as his leg protested. He grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the railing. He peered down the trail. His jaw tightened, the muscles bunching beneath his beard. "Get back," he rasped, "inside." Isabel didn't move. She stepped up onto the porch beside him. Down in the yard, emerging from the mist like ghosts from a bad dream, were 3 riders. They were mud-spattered, their horses heaving from the climb. Leading them, perched on a nervous mare, was Silas Crouch. He looked different than he had on the boardwalk. He wore a heavy oilskin coat and a hat pulled low, but his face was unmistakable, twisted with a frantic, feverish greed. Flanking him were 2 men. Isabel didn't recognize hired guns with low-slung holsters and eyes that scanned the property with professional detachment. "Knox!" Crouch shouted, his voice cracking against the roar of the creek. "Thaddeus Knox! Come out! We have business!" Thaddeus didn't lower the rifle. He filled the porch, a monolith of black leather and menace. "Get off my land," Thaddeus rumbled. Crouch laughed, a high, nervous sound. "Your land? That's a matter of debate, Mr. Knox. You see, we've been examining the payment you made last winter." He reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the silver coins Thaddeus had thrown. He held it up to the weak spring sunlight. "Pure silver," Crouch shouted, his eyes gleaming. "Minted 1850. Heavy, very heavy. And where there's a bag of silver, there's a vein. Where there's a vein, there's a mine." He signaled to the men behind him. They unholstered their revolvers. "The transaction was irregular," Crouch screamed, dropping the pretense of legality. "You underpaid. We're here to collect the interest. Hand over the hoard, Knox, and maybe we let you keep the cripple." Isabel felt a cold knot of rage tighten in her stomach. The cripple. That word again. "There is no hoard," Thaddeus growled. "Leave." "Liar!" Crouch shrieked. He nodded to the man on his right, a scarred drifter with a double-barreled shotgun. "Smoke him out!" The drifter didn't aim at Thaddeus. He aimed at the cabin window. "What?" The shotgun roared. The blast shattered the glass, sending shards flying into the room where Isabel had been baking bread just an hour ago. "Inside!" Thaddeus roared, shoving Isabel through the door. He didn't follow her. He turned back to the yard. Another shot rang out. A bullet struck the porch post inches from Thaddeus's head, sending splinters flying into his face. Something inside Thaddeus Knox snapped. He didn't look at the shattered window. He didn't look at the guns. He looked at the fear in Isabel's eyes as she stumbled back. The grizzly vanished. The beast emerged. He roared. It wasn't a word. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fury that shook the remaining snow from the pine boughs. He didn't retreat into the cabin. He charged. He leaped off the porch, bypassing the steps, landing in the mud with a splash that coated the nearest rider. His bad leg buckled for a second, but rage propelled him forward. He swung the rifle like a club, the stock connecting with the drifter's horse. The animal screamed and reared, throwing the rider. Thaddeus didn't stop. He was a whirlwind of violence. He grabbed the fallen rider by the collar and hurled him into the mud, knocking the wind out of him. "Shoot him! Shoot the freak!" Crouch screamed, wheeling his horse around in panic. A bullet struck Thaddeus in the shoulder. He didn't even stumble. He barely seemed to feel it. He grabbed the axe from the chopping block with his good hand and swung it into the earth, creating a barrier between himself and the remaining gunmen. But there were too many of them. The third man, a cool-headed professional, had dismounted. He circled around the melee, aiming his Colt Navy revolver at Thaddeus's exposed back. "Good night, Trapper," the gunman muttered, cocking the hammer. Thaddeus was occupied wrestling the shotgun away from the first attacker. He didn't see the man behind him. Inside the cabin, Isabel Sterling looked at the stove. The fire was roaring. A pot of water she had put on for laundry was boiling furiously, steam rising in a thick cloud. She looked at the chaos outside. She saw Thaddeus fighting two men in the mud. She saw the third man leveling his pistol. The terror was clawing at her throat, telling her to curl into a ball, to hide, to let them take her back to the bucket and the brush. No, a voice whispered in her head, not this time. She wasn't a cripple. She wasn't a ledger entry. She was the woman who had cut a man's clothes off to save his life. She grabbed the handle of the cast-iron pot with a thick rag. It was heavy. It was scalding. She ran to the door. "Hey!" she screamed. The gunman turned, startled by the noise. Isabel didn't hesitate. She swung the pot. A sheet of boiling water arched through the air. It hit the gunman full in the face. The man shrieked a high, bubbling sound of agony. He dropped the pistol, clutching his eyes, staggering back blindly. "My eyes! My eyes!" Isabel didn't stop. She dropped the empty pot. She grabbed the shotgun Thaddeus had left by the door, the one he kept loaded for bears. She stepped out onto the porch. She raised the heavy weapon. It trembled in her hands, but she jammed the stock against her shoulder. "Get away from him!" she screamed, leveling the barrels at Crouch. Crouch stared at her. He looked at his hired guns, one writhing in the mud with scalded eyes, one unconscious from Thaddeus's throw. He looked at Thaddeus, who was now standing up, blood streaming from his shoulder, breathing like a steam engine. And he looked at the girl he had sold for a bag of silver, who was now holding a shotgun with steady hands. "You," Crouch stammered, "you're supposed to be broken." "I was burned," Isabel yelled back. "Now run!" She pulled the trigger on the first barrel. Boom! The shot went wide, kicking up mud inches from Crouch's horse. The horse bolted. Crouch shrieked, clinging to the mane as the animal tore down the path, terrified by the noise. The remaining conscious gunmen didn't wait. They scrambled for their mounts, dragging their injured comrade, slipping and sliding in their haste to get away from the demon trapper and his fire witch bride. Thaddeus didn't chase them. He watched them go until they disappeared into the trees. Then he turned to the porch. Isabel stood there, the shotgun smoking in her hands. Her chest was heaving, her scar was glowing in the sunlight. She looked fierce. She looked wild. Thaddeus limped toward her. He dropped the axe. He fell to his knees at the bottom of the steps, ignoring his wounded shoulder. He looked up at her. "You came out," he whispered, staring at her wild eyes. "The gun. You came out." "I told you," Isabel panted, lowering the weapon. "I know what fire does. I wasn't going to let them burn you down." Thaddeus looked at the scalded mud where the gunman had stood, then back at her. He realized then that he hadn't saved her from the town. She had saved him. He reached up with his good hand. Isabel dropped the gun and fell to her knees on the porch, reaching down to him. He grabbed her hand, the one that had held the scalding pot. He pressed his forehead against her knuckles, closing his eyes as the adrenaline finally crashed, leaving them shivering in the wreckage of their victory. The silence that followed the gunfire was heavier than the blizzard had been. It pressed down on the valley, suffocating the roar of the creek and the wind in the pines. The air on the porch tasted of sulfur, sharp and metallic, and the copper tang of fresh blood. Isabel dropped the shotgun. It clattered against the wooden planks, the sound echoing like a final gavel strike. Her hands, which had been steady enough to pull the trigger, began to tremble violently. The adrenaline that had turned her into a warrior was receding, leaving a cold, hollow shock in its wake. Thaddeus groaned. He was kneeling at the bottom of the steps, his good hand gripping the railing until the wood splintered. His left shoulder was a ruin. The bullet had torn through the heavy muscle of his trapezius, shattering the silence of his body with a scream of torn flesh. Blood soaked the entire left side of his buckskin shirt, turning the leather black and slick. "Thaddeus!" Isabel gasped, the paralysis breaking. She scrambled down the steps, her boots slipping in the mud that was still steaming from the scalded gunman. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over the wound, terrified to touch it, terrified not to. "Inside," Thaddeus rasped. His face was gray, the color drained away to leave his tan looking like old parchment. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mixing with the dirt and gunpowder residue. "Before! More come!" "No one is coming," Isabel said, her voice shaking. "They ran. You scared the devil out of them." "Inside," he repeated, stubborn as the granite he lived on. He tried to stand. His legs buckled. Isabel didn't think. She jammed her shoulder under his good arm. She was half his size, a reed against an oak, but she pushed with a hysterical strength. "Up," she commanded. "Move your feet, Grizzly. Don't you dare die in the mud." Thaddeus grunted, a sound of pure agony, and forced his legs to work. Together, they stumbled up the stairs, a three-legged beast of burden lurching toward the sanctuary of the door. They crashed into the cabin, Thaddeus collapsing onto the bearskin rug before they could reach the bed. He lay there, breathing in shallow, hitching gasps, his eyes squeezed shut against the pain. Isabel kicked the door shut and threw the heavy oak bar into place. Then she turned to the war she could fight. She grabbed the shears, she grabbed the whiskey, she grabbed the needle. "I have to cut the shirt," she said, kneeling beside him. Thaddeus nodded weakly. She sheared the leather away. The wound was ugly, a dark, puckered hole that oozed sluggishly. But as she cleaned it, pouring the whiskey that made him arch his back and hiss through his teeth, she saw that the bullet had passed through. It hadn't hit the bone. It hadn't hit the lung. "Clean through," she whispered, relief making her dizzy. "It missed the joint." She threaded the needle. Her hands, scarred and raw from the winter work, found their rhythm. She stitched the mountain man back together, sewing the edges of his skin with the same care she had once used to mend her veil. But this time, she wasn't hiding a wound, she was healing one. Thaddeus watched her through slit eyes. He watched the fierce concentration on her face. He watched the way her hair, freed from its tie during the fight, fell across her scarred cheek, no longer hidden, no longer ashamed. When the last knot was tied, Isabel sat back on her heels, wiping her bloody hands on her apron. She was exhausted, her face streaked with soot and tears. Thaddeus reached out with his good hand. He grabbed the edge of the table and pulled himself into a sitting position, ignoring her protests. "You need to lie down," Isabel scolded, reaching for him. "No," Thaddeus growled. He looked at the floorboards. He looked at the shotgun leaning against the wall. He looked at the shattered window. "You have to go," he said. The words hung in the air, colder than the draft from the broken glass. Isabel blinked. "What?" Thaddeus dragged himself to the heavy iron box he kept under the floorboard. His life savings, the silver from the trap lines. He threw the lid open. It was half empty from buying her indenture, but there was still enough silver there to buy a farm, a ticket east, a new life. He pushed the box toward her. "Take it," he rasped, avoiding her eyes. "Take the mule. He's steady. He'll get you to Silverton. The sister's there. They will take you in." Isabel stared at the silver. Then she stared at him. A slow, hot anger began to bubble in her chest, replacing the fear. "You're sending me away?" she asked quietly, "after I just fought for you?" "Because you fought for me," Thaddeus roared, the sudden volume making him wince in pain. He slammed his hand on the floor. "Look at this place, Isabel. It's a target. I am a target." He gestured to his blood-soaked shoulder. "I brought this to you," he choked out, his voice cracking with guilt. "I bought you to give you silence, to give you safety, and instead I brought gunmen to your door. I made you scold a man. I made you hold a killing weapon." He looked at her then, and the anguish in his amber eyes was of physical weight. "I am a beast, Isabel. Violence follows me like a shadow. You are too good to be covered in my blood. You deserve a life where you don't have to sew up bullet holes." He pushed the box closer, his hand trembling. "Go. Find a place where people are soft, where they don't look at scars. Be safe." Isabel looked at the box. She looked at the silver that represented her freedom. She stood up. She walked over to the box. She picked it up. It was heavy. Thaddeus watched her, his heart breaking in his chest. He told himself it was for the best. She would go. She would find a husband who didn't live in a cave. She would be happy. Isabel turned and walked to the door. Then she turned back. She didn't walk out. She walked to the hearth. She tilted the box. Clatter, clink, ping. She dumped the silver onto the stone hearth, right into the ashes of the fire. The coins scattered among the coals, glittering uselessly in the heat. Thaddeus stared, his mouth falling open. "Isabel?" Isabel dropped the empty box on the floor. She walked back to him. She didn't look soft. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the iron he hammered in the forge, hardened, tested, and unbreakable. "You think I want soft?" she asked, her voice trembling with intensity. "Thaddeus, I lived in soft. The town was civilized. The people who laughed at me wore silk and velvet. The man who tore my veil off was a businessman." She knelt in front of him, invading his space, forcing him to look at her. "Softness didn't save me," she whispered. "Softness let me burn. Softness mocked me while I scrubbed the mud." She reached out and took his large, rough hand, the hand that had saved her from the auction block. She pressed it against her chest, right over her heart. "You think you're a beast because you fight?" she asked. "You fought for me. You took a bullet for me. That isn't a beast, Thaddeus. That is a hero." She leaned closer, her nose inches from his. "You say violence follows you. Well, it followed me too. But out here, we fight back. I am not a porcelain doll you can put on a shelf in a convent. I am the woman who blinded a man to save her husband." The word hung in the air. Husband. Thaddeus stopped breathing. He looked at her face. He saw the soot. He saw the exhaustion. But mostly, he saw the scar. For months, he had been careful not to look at it too long, afraid of making her feel ashamed. He had treated it like a wound that needed to be ignored. But now, in the firelight, he saw it for what it was. It wasn't a disfigurement. It was armor. It was the map of her survival. "Isabel," he breathed, his voice breaking. He reached up with his trembling hand. He didn't touch her good cheek. He didn't touch her hair. He cupped the left side of her face. His callous thumb ran over the shiny, melted skin of her cheek. He traced the ridge of the burn that ran down to her jaw. He touched the place where the fire had tried to take her beauty, and failed. Isabel gasped, her eyes fluttering shut. No one touched the scar. No one. It was dead flesh to the world. But to him it was warm. "Not damaged," Thaddeus whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Not a monster." He leaned forward, ignoring the screaming pain in his shoulder. He pressed his lips to the scar. It was a soft reverence kiss right on the ruin of her cheek. He kissed the pain. He kissed the shame. He kissed the years of hiding. Isabel let out a sob, a sound of pure, fracturing relief. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his beard, holding him as tight as she could. Thaddeus pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. "Wife," he rumbled, "my wife." It wasn't a question. It was a vow. It was a claiming deeper than any paper or silver coin could buy. Isabel smiled, a tear tracking through the soot on her face. "And don't you forget it, Grizzly." Thaddeus let out a laugh, a wet, choked sound, and pulled her down against his good shoulder. The wind howled outside, and the broken window let in the cold, but it didn't matter. The fire was lit, the door was barred, and the ash girl had finally found a flame that wouldn't burn her. Epilogue 1 year later. The summer sun hit the high peaks of the Rockies with a brilliance that made the granite sparkle like diamonds. The snow was gone, replaced by a carpet of green sedge and wildflowers that clung to the rocky soil with stubborn defiance. The cabin still stood against the cliff, but it had changed. The broken window had been replaced with double-pane glass, carried up the mountain by mule train. A new room had been added to the side, a nursery, though it was currently filled with curing hides and drying herbs. But the biggest change was the garden. A patch of earth near the creek had been cleared of stones. A sturdy fence, built of thick pine logs, kept the deer and elk at bay. Inside, rows of hardy potatoes, mountain kale, and bright purple monkshood grew in the dark soil. Thaddeus Knox sat on the porch bench. He was cleaning his rifle, the metal gleaming with oil. His shoulders stiffened when the weather turned, but he moved with the easy, rolling power of a man who was master of his domain. The beard was trimmed, and his eyes were clear, crinkling at the corners as he looked out at the yard. Isabel was in the garden. She was kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds. She wore a simple dress of blue calico, the sleeves rolled up to reveal her strong, tanned arms. She wasn't wearing a veil. A group of trappers, passing through the pass on their way to Silverton, paused on the trail below. They looked up at the legendary Grizzly's den. They had heard the stories of a monster who bought a ghost, stories of a witch who fought off gunmen with boiling water. They watched as Isabel stood up, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. The sun caught the left side of her face. The scar was there, silver and stark against her skin. She didn't turn away. She didn't hide. She waved to Thaddeus. "Thaddeus!" she called out, her voice ringing clear as a bell across the valley. "The stew is ready." Thaddeus set the rifle down. He stood up, his shadow stretching long across the porch. He walked down the steps, limping slightly, and crossed the yard to the garden gate. He didn't care about the trappers watching. He didn't care about the world below. He opened the gate and pulled Isabel into his arms. He kissed her not on the scar this time, but full on the lips, a kiss of passion and peace. "Coming, wife," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against her chest. He took her hand, her dirty, scarred, beautiful hand, and led her back toward the cabin. The trappers watched them go, confused. They had expected a horror story. They had expected a beast and a victim. Instead, they saw a king and a queen ruling a kingdom of rock and sky, bound together by scars that had healed into something stronger than skin. The wind blew through the bone chimes, but they no longer sounded like skeletons. They sounded like music,